Hi everyone, my name is Margalit Schindler and I use they, them pronouns. And I'm the Preventive Conservation Fellow at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today for our final learning session in our Let's Talk About That Dialogue series, which is focused on various issues of diversity and inclusion in the field of collections care. I'm largely going to turn this over to our facilitator of all of our sessions, Sarah Ferrone, but I have a few pieces of housekeeping before we begin. First, toward the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a box that says CC Live Transcript. Click on that and then click Show Subtitle. There may be a lag, but then they should appear. I will drop that in the chat as well. Today's event is set up as a webinar, which among other things means that participants cannot speak, but can interact by typing in the chat box or by the Q&A. Don't fret, tomorrow will be a meeting and we'll be able to have a more robust and healthy discussion with all of the various participants. While our discussion tomorrow and all the subsequent second days of these sessions will not be recorded for privacy issues and to allow for vulnerability in this space, this initial content portion where we're learning from Janelle will be recorded, including anything contained in the chat box, and that will be used to help create the toolkit that we are kind of pulling together and creating from all of these sessions. If you have questions toward the end of the session today, please enter them in the chat. And remember that tomorrow is completely devoted to discussion. So if there's a question we don't get to today, we may find it relevant and circle back to it tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to introduce and turn things over to our facilitator, Sarah Ferrone. Sarah is the principal of Dialogic Consulting, where she brings over 20 years of facilitation and training experience to every project, making hard conversations productive and enabling teams to work more effectively. She has been our wonderful facilitator and guide throughout this whole series, and I'm happy to pass it off to her. Sarah?
Thank you, Margalit, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you for the sixth and final session of these series. And no pressure, Janelle, but we have just been building up to you across the course of the last few sessions. I want to take a moment to appreciate the time and energy of both Alana Schaefer and Margalit Schindler of CCAHA, who will be taking notes during today's session in addition to our recording, as they are the primary authors of each session's toolkit. I'm grateful not only for them, but for many things, and would like to acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home where I join you from in northern New Jersey, the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands each of us sit, and the labor of people who were enslaved in constructing many of the institutions that we work for and with. To get us started today, it is my pleasure to introduce our colleague and our speaker for today's session, Janelle Austin. Janelle is the executive director of the George Floyd Global Memorial, a living memorial established to bring together members of George Floyd's family and the local community to preserve over 2,500 offerings of street art, drawings by children, protest signs, rocks, letters, paintings, flowers, and other meaningful gifts that transformed the intersection where George Floyd was murdered at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department into a sacred site. Moreover, the memorial pushes against the constructs of racism that have historically denied BIPOC communities control over their own narratives. Janelle has over 15 years of experience in facilitating group conversations on race, designing racism and multicultural educational programs, mentoring individuals, and supporting institutional leadership as they think through strategies to take diversity and inclusion integration seriously. She studied and worked at Fuller Theological Seminary for nearly 11 years, finally as the Director of Operations for the Pinnell Center for African American Church Studies. Through her work, Janelle was able to build creative partnerships and community support that helped Fuller Seminary make progress in its institutional goals to practice racial justice. Janelle holds a master's in divinity and Christian ethics and a master's of arts in intercultural studies with additional training in sociology. Today, Janelle will discuss what happens when a group of neighbors are presented with an opportunity to preserve and tell their own story, explore the impact of community voices, embodied action, and philosophical thought in the preservation and conservation of their story, their way, at George Floyd Square. Janelle, it is my pleasure to turn the mic and the screen over to you. I can't wait to answer some questions and speak with you later.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. And it's so good to be able to engage in this conversation around cultural heritage preservation and diversity, and really bring my story and my community's story to the table for food for thought. Um, I titled today's conversation Community Voices, Practices, a Practice and Thought in Cultural Heritage Preservation, because it really embodies and captures what our story has been here in Minneapolis for nearly 2 years. So May 26th, 2022 will be 2 years since the people rose up and started lifting their voices. And so as I go through this conversation today, even though I know this is in webinar format, please jot your questions down, contribute, ask any question that I was asked before we jumped on. Was there anything that I wanted to be asked? And my response is simply, I want you to ask whatever it is that is on your heart, or that you're wrestling with, and that hopefully I can provide perspective through my experience. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm actually going to kind of go in the reverse order that I titled this experience. And I'm actually going to start with the philosophical thought. And the reason why, because what we believe, our core values, our worldview, the way in which we've been shaped, really anchors how we engage everything in life, how we move, how we respond, if we jump or if we sit, if we speak up or if we stay quiet, how we have been shaped to engage the world, or how we choose to root the ways in which we engage the world is always rooted in our philosophical thought processes. And so I want to start us there. I want to start us where, with our core values, the way in which we engage the world. So we actually have 5 assumptions and 2 core values, and at George Floyd Square. So the 5 assumptions are not in the presentation. The 2 core values are. So I'm actually going to give you guys the 5 assumptions first, and then I'll move on to the core values, because the 5 assumptions are fun. So when we gather as a community in George Floyd Square, which has been happening since June 15th of 2020, we have morning and evening meetings twice a day. We have a morning and evening meeting. We meet twice a day, every day, 7 days a week since June 15th, 2020. There have only been a few occasions in which we chose not to meet because of larger things happening in our society, in our community, and out of response to our collective experience, we would cancel a meeting. But otherwise, these meetings exist now. And it's a way to bring our community together. And we start every meeting with this. Number 1, assume everybody has COVID. Mask up or back up. Number 2, assume that everybody's armed. It pays to be polite. 3, assume that everything you say or do is being recorded, which is happening right now. So if you say something, say it with your whole chest. Number 4, assume that not everybody in this circle or in this square has your idea of liberation in mind. And number 5, assume that everyone carries some level of trauma. So we must be patient with each other to be dangerous together. So we kind of, as a community, anchor ourselves in those assumptions and how we move through life, how we move in this protest, how we move in this movement, how we move in our communities. But then there are these core principles. I even call them vows of a caretaker that really emerged out of the caretaker movement at George Floyd Square. That is a little bit more specific to our work in tending to the memorial. And that is simply, one, that everything is somebody's offering, therefore nothing is thrown away. And two, that the people are more sacred than the memorial itself. So we're people over property all day, every day. And this is important. This is important for two, not just for two main reasons, but when we were navigating the uprising, what I noticed, so first of all, you have to start with the fact that my background, my training is theology, is in ministry. And so it is caring for people. It is how do you walk with people? How do you hold space with people? How do you navigate pain? And so when I came into the space of George Floyd Square, which is 3 blocks away from my family home, my family's lived in the neighborhood for 37 years now. When I came into that space, it was from the perspective of how do we hold this grief together. We live in a society that doesn't really value or appreciate public grief. When someone dies in your community or in your family, it's like you get 3 days and then you got to get back to work and pretend as if everything is normal. People tell grieving folks, well, you just need to figure out how to move on. You just need to keep going. You need to do something new, as if that trauma of death did not occur. And so knowing that we live in that kind of society and coming into this space where people were memorializing the death of a man that for the most part, most people had never met. But yet somehow they saw themselves in this man. Yet somehow they felt the grief, they felt the pain, they felt the trauma, and they felt the need to show up to where he took his last breath and respond. And so in those responses, people were bringing whatever they had. People were bringing plants. People were bringing synthetic flowers. People had marched in the streets and would make a protest sign out of whatever they could. And then they would march to George Floyd Square and lay it down as an offering in the place where George Floyd took his last breath. People would bring their bike helmet. People would bring their water bottle. People would bring their baby bassinet. People would bring photos of their loved ones that they lost. People would bring any and everything that they felt had significance for them to lay down as an offering. I met a young Jewish man who brought a rock and laid it down because he said in his tradition, rocks were a living organism or a living thing. And so you wouldn't lay death on death. So a cut flower would represent death, but a rock would represent a living thing. And so you lay life on top of death. So there was a lot of different aspects and angles that people were coming. There was baby blankets. There were stuffed animals, tons of stuffed animals. There were balloons. There were coins. There were, I found some lip gloss, a full tube of lip gloss. I saw people lay down fruit or fruit snacks or candy. People laid down drawings on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. Literally whatever people had, people laid down. And so then what I also began to witness is that there are others who decided that they wanted to start gatekeeping the memorial. And gatekeeping what could or should be laid down, what was aesthetically acceptable, what had merit to stay and what had merit to not stay. And so I quickly took my community authority of showing up every day to tend to the memorial to start providing guidance and instructions on the fact that when the community named this intersection as sacred, like that was the first thing I heard when I stepped foot in the intersection, is people saying out loud, this is a sacred space, this is a sacred space. You saw people walking around with sage and cleansing the area. The amount of religiosity and spirituality that was being navigated in that space, for me was like, okay, I know this. I'm trained in the religious world. And so I understand what is happening here. But the moment I saw people started to curate the space and say what could be here and what cannot be here, that's when I started to assert the moral authority that had been given to me by showing up to tend to the memorial as a community member, to really instruct people that these are offerings. Like if somebody's going to bring something to a memorial, and if we as a community are going to deem this as a sacred space, then all around the world in religions and traditions across the world, what is brought into a sacred space is an offering. So that is why we call them offerings and not tributes or anything else, because it's deemed as sacred. And whenever an offering is laid, you don't treat an offering any kind of way. You don't just discard an offering. You don't just throw away an offering. And so I wanted to make sure that the community around us understood that these, what you all might in your field call artifacts, were sacred simply because they were laid at a sacred site. And then we had the responsibility, a caretaker once called me out and said, this feels like a priesthood. But yes, we have the responsibility, like a priesthood, to care for what somebody else is laying down out of their pain, out of their hope, out of their grief. And also, we have the responsibility to care for the people who are coming to lay something down. So we cannot get so caught up in the things. We cannot get so caught up in the stuff. We cannot get so caught up in the property, in the material artifacts, that we forget about the actual person who is laying it down. And so I would instruct the caretakers to say, if someone taps you on the shoulder and starts asking questions, I need you to pause whatever it is that you're doing and tend to that person, because the people are more sacred than the memorial. And this was essential because the fight that we are fighting in Black liberation is a kind of fight in which racism says property is more important than Black bodies. And not only that, but Black bodies stem from this legacy of where whiteness referred to us as property. So we needed to be extra diligent to be able to care for the person behind the offering, behind the object, more so than the object itself. So that was very interesting when we started to engage conservators, whose world was really being shaped by this, by things, by stuff. And so on the FAIC/AIC website, they define preservation, right? So we're talking about cultural heritage preservation. And they define preservation as the protection of cultural property through activities that minimize chemical and physical deterioration and damage, and that prevent loss of informational content. The primary goal of preservation is to prolong the existence of cultural property. Well, so that's fascinating now, because given the philosophy of our movement as caretakers, where we're people over property all day, every day, now we come into this world, into this institution, into this vocation, into this industry that's saying that the heartbeat of preservation is the stuff. The heartbeat of preservation are the things. And that really is something that we as a George Floyd Global Memorial, we as a protest, we as people who live in this balance of preservation and protest have found ourselves in defense of Black lives and in this movement for Black liberation to say, wait a minute, it is not just the police that we're fighting. It's not just the school systems that we're fighting. It's not just fair and equitable pay that we're fighting. It's not just the history of racism and the legacy of it that we're fighting, but it's also these other institutions that have institutionalized racism weaved throughout it, but we would never recognize it at face value. So when you have a kind of definition of cultural heritage preservation that is rooted in property as opposed to people, that for us, we get excited because like, hey, there's something else to change. There's something else to push against. There's something else to challenge in the way that we actually think about doing this cultural heritage preservation work. If culture and heritage are fundamentally rooted in what people create and what people do and what people practice and how people engage and how people speak and how people interact with each other. Culture is deeply rooted in our coexistence as human beings in the context of family, in the context of community. Culture is oftentimes passed down through oral tradition as well, and not just through physical property. So cultural heritage preservation, if I'm gonna come to it through a lens of a Black critique, through the lens of a movement for Black liberation, I then have to say that how do I engage preservation, not just from the aspect of all of these objects that have been laid in the intersection, but first and foremost of the people that we're trying to protect, of their stories, of their voices, of who they are. How do we do this in such a way where we center the people first and foremost, and we de-center the objects? Even though we do care for the objects, we do the cleaning, the number accessioning, the humidification chambers, and reattaching pieces that are broken, or making decisions to keep things detached, if they are come to us detached, making the decisions to keep things muddy if they're muddy, if that's part of their story of the life of the protest. So we're deeply working with objects, but how do we challenge ourselves to even more deeply care about the people who brought the objects, whose energy is held within the objects, whose very lives that we are fighting for, or whose very lives put their bodies on the line to stand in solidarity with people like me? So these are fundamental philosophical questions that we actually have to hold when we're engaging this world of cultural heritage preservation. And how do we decenter property in an industry that has always centered property? How do we decenter property, recenter people, and then uphold the fact that the property actually comes through the lived experience of a person, through the trauma, through the pain, through the creative expression of pain and hope, as I like to say, of this particular community. So that is how we anchor our story. That is how we anchor our work. These are a couple of pieces that come out of George Floyd Square that have been put as offerings. The first one is what I would call your typical offering, where someone took a piece of cardboard and decided to paint it and tell their story that was laid during the uprising. And this particular person they actually created a series of multiple offerings that we have found, in which they took it upon themselves to set the tone and the atmosphere of George Floyd Square. So they created multiple signs, different signs, that could help people posture themselves, especially white-bodied people, posture themselves in a way where they understood what was happening in this movement of Black liberation. How do we come to an intersection that was formerly two busy streets where bus lines met, where we have one state senator on one side of the street and another state senator on the other side, where each corner is actually a different neighborhood, where we have two different council members, two different wards that govern this intersection. So a highly political intersection needed to be transformed into a sanctuary, needed to be transformed into an outdoor cathedral, as I saw someone put it, needed to be transformed or understood through its natural transformation when a death occurred and the people acknowledged, and the land and the earth acknowledged it as sacred space. And so you see this language of reclaim a sense of space. You see the language of healing. You see the language of community. You see the language of remember. And all of this is happening while there's an uprising, right? Well, while buildings are burning down, and understanding that this space here is different. This space here is held for a purpose and for a reason. This space centers people. It centers a moment. It centers a movement. Then you have the Sankofa bird, which was actually installed in January of 2021 by a Black art elder in Minneapolis, Miss Esther, who did enamel on steel at Chicago Fire Arts Center, which is just to the front doors are to the left of this installation. And the Sankofa bird comes from the West African tradition, which many African Americans have adopted. The symbol is of a bird whose feet are facing forward and its head is looking back. And it simply stands for that we have to look back in order to know where we are going. So this idea of remembrance, this idea of where have we been and therefore we know how to go. Again, here you see this offering that is laid and offered in George Floyd Square or installed in George Floyd Square that helps people center themselves, that helps people center people to say, where have we been as a people? And where are we going to go as a people? So therefore, in this work of cultural heritage preservation, is my responsibility as a caretaker to center these stories, to center these voices of the community, and saying that this piece is not just an artifact to be preserved, but it is a kind of piece that centers people first. And therefore, I have to follow the instruction of the piece in order to know how to do the work of the cultural preservation and conservation work. So then I want to move into this conversation then of embodied action. So the philosophies are anchoring us. The philosophies are there. The philosophies are not just something that we created out of our own top of our heads, but it really has been rooted in our own cultural heritage traditions on how we engage people. On how we engage protests. So you see this space of George Floyd Square becoming a square becoming a circle, right? And squares, it was interesting that there was a dialogue on whether it should be called George Floyd Squares, because in the history of this country, squares are places where public lynchings would actually happen. And so to name a place a square, the community, when we wrestled with this, we said, but a lynching did happen here. And so how do we acknowledge that a public lynching happened here? But then we see people always gathering in circles, and we put a garden in the form of a circle. And so in the middle of an intersection, here you have, when people gather, we gather in circles, we protest in circles, and then we march in crowds and movements. You see direct action and embodied action by the people when you actually physically go and light a candle, when you actually physically go and lay down an image that you physically painted, or when you lay down flowers, even if they are synthetic, that you physically go, that you went and you bought, it cost you something, or a rock that you discovered, that you found, that you painted, or a stuffed animal that you had. This embodied action of collective protest, first and foremost, to say, I am adding to this collective memory, I'm adding to this collective action, I'm adding to this voice, this collective voice, to say no more lynchings in my backyard. I'm adding to the voices of our ancestors who jumped off slave ships to refuse to be enchained. I'm adding to the legacy of Harriet Tubman, who was a beast of a fighter with the Underground Railroad. I'm adding to the legacy of Frederick Douglass. I'm adding to the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm adding to the legacy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Maya Angelou and Angela Davis, Cicely Tyson, and Muhammad Ali. I'm adding to it in this embodied action of solidarity. So when we talk about cultural heritage preservation, and it is not just in the artifacts, but is also in this embodied action that people do to say, I am adding to the story that we know that lives in our bodies, to protest the lynchings that take place because of the disregard of Black bodies, the Black death that takes place because of this racial caste system in which we live in America that says Black bodies are not worth anything to us. And so this embodied action is a kind of cultural heritage preservation that it is the kind that you cannot necessarily see, and that you have to have lived into the culture to understand what it is that you are actually adding to, the voice that you're actually preserving. I like to say that the movement for Black liberation started when the first person jumped off a slave ship. So this movement is 400 years old. It did not start with Trayvon Martin. It did not start with a civil rights movement. And this is what we're adding to, and this is the legacy that we are preserving. So when you see children who are writing their names on a fist that is installed to the side of a bus shelter, they are adding to somebody else's offering that. So when a neighbor puts the offering of the fist and then children come and start writing on it and drawing on it, they are adding to the story. They're adding to the preservation. What's fascinating about this particular fist on the left side is that we did not code it intentionally. That was a question that we had, because we said, oh, the artist came to us and said, this is wood from my backyard. If it goes through winter, it's going to crack. And we said, okay, cool. And so we made that intentional decision not to code it, because we knew that if we had coded it to quote unquote preserve it, what would happen is we would lose the element of people being able to add their story and what was more, or their name or their thoughts or their experiences. And so we value that kind of cultural preservation over and against the preservation of an object, to say that the voices of the people are more important than the object itself. And so we're making those kinds of ethical decisions as we go. On the photo on the right is myself and my older brother. My brother lives right next door. I moved back home with my mom. My brother moved next door to my mom. And this is on Martin Luther King Day 2021, where we installed the steel fist in the middle of the intersection. It had previously been a wooden fist, and then we removed the wooden fist, installed a wooden hand in order for us to then bring in a steel fist that was casted in the intersection at Chicago Fire Arts Center, and that the people we installed with our own hands and ropes and poles. And so what you have even here is the work of the people being able to install. What are we preserving? The flag, the story of the Pan-African flag on top of that. What is the narrative that we are preserving and holding, and what we contribute to, and add to that, even as we change out installations? There's this kind of aspect of, it's not about preserving the object, but it's about preserving this legacy, this story, this heritage of the fight for our own liberation. Representative John Lewis, the late Representative John Lewis, said, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and help redeem the soul of America. And so this has presented a keen opportunity for us in George Floyd Square at the George Floyd Global Memorial to think about, how is the work of cultural heritage preservation a part of good trouble? How do we take this industry that has historically been put in the bottom of museums, have been hidden away from the people? How do we bring this industry to the forefront and say, no, this industry is key to the movement for Black liberation. This industry is good trouble, necessary trouble. This industry is redeeming the soul of America, because we are ensuring that the story of Black liberation in this movement since 2020 is being preserved accurately and true and in a trustworthy way by the people, for the people. Again, I am doing cultural heritage preservation, and my background is in theology. I was not trained for this. But what we found was that we, the people on the ground who experienced the story, we know the story, and therefore we also then know how to preserve the story. And so this embodied action that we participated in actually helps us with the work of making sure that the story is told accurately, because we were there to witness how the story has unfolded and is unfolding. And so then we can bring cultural heritage preservation action into the center of this movement for racial justice and Black liberation. Again, embodied work, the building of a greenhouse on site so we could preserve plants that were laid as an offering, so that we could preserve planters that were laid as an offering. So we get a little bit creative. It's not just about bringing something indoors so it could be protected perfectly. It's about being able to say, how can we extend the life of protest of an offering? Or when somebody came in and burned offerings because they decided that they didn't want those offerings to exist anymore, then how do we come in with our story lens and say, the centering of these voices as a sacred space, and saying that these are burnt offerings. So just because they're burned doesn't mean that their story has gone away, but it has just simply pivoted to be a burnt offering. And then how do we tell the story of burnt offerings? How do we not just simply try to clean it up or simply try to throw away? How do we say everything is still somebody's offering, and we are going to care for it and hold it for the story that of its own protest? And then finally, community voices. I think it's so important that we understand that the collective, that the community, that people's voices are so important to cultural heritage preservation. I'll never forget the day when we've been collaborating with the Midwest Arts Conservation Center since June 15th of 2020. And one of the conservators had asked a question about a protest sign. And they said, it was a double-sided sign. And it said, which is the front and which is the back? And one of our Black community members who was volunteering to help learn conservation and do the conservation work, he had said, well, when we're in a protest, usually we say, no justice, no streets. And then on the backside, we'll have something like prosecute the police. And so the front of the sign is the no justice, no peace. And then whatever it is, the tagline on the back, that is the backside, because the conservator actually didn't know. As a white conservator, and I don't know if they had participated in protests or not, but they didn't know, they weren't there. But to have a community member there who's embodied the protest, who has a philosophical thought of people over property, of everything is somebody's offering, and then who comes in and has gone through the embodied action, has gone through the protest, has his lived experience as a Black man, and then is navigating his voice to be able to provide instruction in the work of conservation, to even tell somebody which side of a double-sided sign is the front and is the back. Simply because when you're working with a piece of cardboard that looks the same on the other side, how does one know? How does one know if it's not your lived and embodied experience? So community voices matter. So when I look at all of these protest signs that have been laid, these are voices. These are voices of the people. These are voices of the story. And what I like to say about the memorial, I like to say that it's a 10-part chorus that sings the tune of justice. And so it's like you hear this whole chorus with all these voices and all these sounds. So one offering by itself, it creates a sound and it could be cool. But when you get all of the offerings together, singing in the tune of justice, you get this amazing voice collectively of the people. And these signs, these objects, these artifacts, they hold the voices of the people. They hold that energy. And so when you see on the right, when we're doing the work of caretaking, when we're examining the stories that people are writing, and the messages that people are conveying, this goes into our work of care. So it's not about expediency. It's not about how fast can we get through these thousands of signs and artifacts so we can, as quickly as possible, give them a session number and figure out how do we re-exhibit them. But it really is, how do we take our time with something that is sacred and precious, where somebody took their time to write what they needed to write, to feel what they needed to feel? How do we equally take the time to hold these things as sacred and to make sure that we're giving them due process and due justice, of understanding their power to know how to care for it as best as possible, simply because that's somebody's voice and not just an object. It's somebody's tears, it's somebody's screams, it's somebody's silence in order to fight against racial injustice. Maya Angelou wrote, "The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown, but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom." All of these offerings, they sing of freedom. And if not freedom for oneself, freedom for another. And so it is our job in doing the work of cultural heritage preservation and doing the work of art conservation is to hold those stories of freedom, whether it is the names of stolen lives painted onto the street, to ensure that the names are always vibrant, that the names are always seen, that the names are always heard. Or is it to create reminders of of what we're here for, love and service to our community out of snow and ice in the wintertime. Whatever it is that we need to do to remember and hold that, and preserving this heritage, these voices you see, and hold the community voices that are being projected everywhere in the memorial, whether outside or inside in the work of preservation. And as I've been saying, that my reiteration is all of it is cultural heritage preservation, from our philosophical thought to our embodied action, to our community voices, taking those things out of the streets and into the conservation room, and saying that conservation is an extension of this protest. Conservation is an extension of this fight for Black liberation. And we have to be intentional to take it and make it as such, because conservation inherently, it has its own racialized nuances. And so how do we then take this moment in time to even push back against the industry to do cultural heritage preservation in a way that makes sense for our work? So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for holding space with me. That's my presentation. Sorry, I was a little bit over 30 minutes, but I did the best I could, y'all.
Janelle, you can have as much time as you want. I almost hated coming back on the screen. So a reminder to all of you who are with us, our format for the rest of our time together is really to take the opportunity to have you be able to ask any questions of Janelle that you'd like, and that she has so graciously given of her time to answer for you. Tomorrow we'll be in dialogue with each other as well. So there is a lot of time at our disposal to really dig into some of the thoughts that Janelle shared with us and the practices of this space. But if anything is pressing right now that you would like to ask her, you should do it now, because she won't necessarily be with us tomorrow as we continue to dig in. So I see some questions are already coming into the chat. I'm going to ask you one very quickly, Janelle, before we move into the chat from all of our participants here today. Sure, which is we have paid a lot of attention in the course of our work across these 6 sessions around word choice. And the word choice that you and the other volunteers and folks at the memorial are using seems so very intentional. You consistently referred to the people who are populating the space as caretakers. As a term, and in museum parlance, we choose educators and facilitators and docents and frontline teams and all of these words. I would love if you would tell us a little bit about how that word was specifically chosen.
It was given to us by the community. I didn't choose it. So we were we would say we were tending to the memorial, and then someone decided to make a sign to let people, because people were trying to steal stuff out of the memorial to auction it off, and people were trying to claim that they were taking care of the memorial. And so someone decided that they wanted to give us the kind of authority over tending to the memorial, because we were doing it every day and we were bona fide neighbors with addresses that people knew that, okay, these people are here and they're not going to take it. And so someone, a neighbor came up with a sign that said, the memorial is being taken care of by community caretakers. Please do not take anything out of the memorial. Please do not touch anything. Like we've got it. So if people had questions, like, we've got it. So they gave us the name of caretakers, and it stuck. And then eventually somebody started calling me lead caretaker, and then that stuck. And so in that sense, it's actually an honor, because it wasn't something a title that we gave ourselves, but it was something that the community witnessed of the work that we were doing. And then they said, we want to bestow upon you this name for the work that you're doing. And so it's an honor that we hold that name, because people witnessed our work and then said, this is how we want to call it.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Nyla who said, did you experience any pushback in preservation methods from the conservators working with you at the memorial site?
No, we were absolutely blessed in the sense that there was, so we say at George Floyd Square, bring your gifts to the square, bring your gifts to the movement. And we work in the currency of mutual aid. And so when the conservators came, the exchange we made was simply this: you teach us how to do conservation, and we will teach you how to leverage your skill set for this movement. And that was the agreement. And that's what we've been continuing to do ever since, is they teach us how to think about the science of conservation and how to think about things through their experiences, but then they always pause to say, but this is your story, this is your movement, we are going to defer to your voice. And is this is how we typically do it in conservation, but is this how you want to do it? And therefore we get to veto any decision made by a conservator based off of this movement and based off of how we're trying to push against a racialized institution. So there are times when I say, oh, I didn't know that about the science of conservation, and then that's good to know and hold, and maybe we should try that. And there are other times I will say, yeah, that's not what we're trying to do here. And so we need to go a different route. And they're like, okay. But what we try to do collectively, I say the word I because sometimes I'm the one speaking, but what we try to do collectively is hold some of the more deeper critical conversations in caretaker circles to say, okay, here's the dilemma, here's the problem. How do we think about this? And what are our collective opinions? What are things before we actually make a critical decision? So we try to move by consensus where we can on those kinds of things. And not just consensus of all the caretakers, but specifically Black caretakers, and bringing people to the table to say, okay, how do we think about this in this movement for Black liberation? Is this what we want to do or how we want to do it? So yeah, so there's exchange, but never have I ever experienced the conservators that we're in relationship with saying, this is how you have to do it because this is the way conservation has always done it. They defer to us as Black voices in a movement for our own liberation.
And Janelle, we're continuing to see questions coming in because we're talking about possible pushback and fortunately having not received some from conservators. How have other cultural institutions engaged with y'all in the sense of, I don't want to use the words laying claim or taking, but how has that been in working in this space in Minneapolis and other people trying to collect or tell this story?
Yeah, so in the beginning, during the uprising, I had an email chain of about 20 different folks from like different institutions having a dialogue about what do we do with all the things. So the thing about Black culture is that when there's a memorial, it first and foremost goes to the family. And so we all had a limit in terms of what we could even do and how we could even make a decision. But we also understood that we're dealing with a grieving family, and the last thing that they probably would want to talk about are protest signs. So there are some key decisions that we were trying to make in advance, or to be able to provide options to the family to say, well, what do you want to do? Here are things that we've thought through. What do you want to do? And so in that kind of core group of folks, it included the African American History Museum and Gallery. It included some of the academic institutions. It excluded a lot of the white museum institutions because they have historically been known to try to grab and take stuff for their own purposes and colonize and commandeer. And so
for decades and centuries and millennia.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so they've been held at bay. And they were held at bay first and foremost by the Black artists in the community before I even knew that they were held at bay. And so for that, I'm deeply thankful for the Black artists who understood the exploitation of their work by museums. And they were basically like, don't touch it. So we as neighbors and community members who felt this divine call to tend to this story, not having a background in museums or not having a background in art necessarily, they provided a kind of halo around us to figure it out. And then what was quickly noted that there was too many things for any one institution to hold it all, so that it would have to get split up. And the community said that they didn't want it to get split up. And so that's when we then went to the family about July 15th of 2020 and said, okay, we've gone as far as we can without family opinion. And now we need to have the family opinion. And they decided that they wanted to create an institution to hold it all and keep everything together. And that is how the George Floyd Global Memorial was formed. Is that we did as much as we could as a community to care for things, and it really was Black culture that protected everything, because we all respected this understanding that no one can make a final move until the family says what it's going to be. So we respect Black families in that way, the grieving families in that way. So that's kind of how that happened, and how we got to where we are, and why we had to create a new institution to govern and not just redistribute it to other institutions. The community wanted to keep it together, and it was way too large for any single existing institution to take on themselves, and the white institutions were not welcome to have a voice.
Awesome. There's another question in the chat right now. For the offerings that were temporary in nature, ice sculptures, right, or flower arrangements, how have you preserved them? Are they captured in photos? Are they left undocumented?
Yes, both hands.
Both hands.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, everything's first and foremost protest. Someone maybe a year or so ago had asked me the question about the ethics of preservation. Who gets to decide when something gets removed from the memorial to preservation? And simply we say, so everything exists first and foremost as a protest, and so we try to leave it out in the memorial outside as long as possible. As long as possible. And then our decisions for taking it in is if it presents a threat to people, like it starts to develop mold, and again, people over property. So that's where our core values come in, right? So people over property. So if the property has mold on it and that could cause harm to a human person, then we're going to bring it in. Or let's say someone laid down something that was glass that was knocked over by someone's foot and now it's broken, and that could potentially cause harm to a child or someone, then we're going to remove that out of the memorial and put that into preservation. Or for example, if the thing is under threat of being stolen, like someone is trying to take it out of the memorial and we know that the memorial is sacred and to be kept and preserved, then we will sometimes remove things out of the memorial, either temporarily or permanently, depending on the level of threat of to the memorial, of people trying to capitalize off of it. So that's where we're trying to protect from the capitalization of Black death, as opposed to trying to say, oh, we want to preserve it and keep it for ourselves. It's not that. It's just to say this stuff is sacred and we want to make sure that people aren't exploiting it. And if we get wind that there are people who are trying to take things to exploit them or is that threat, then we'll remove it. Or then finally, if the wind or the earth decides to remove it out of the memorial and we find it a half block down, we'll pick it up and take it into preservation. So some things we find and we keep putting it back, and then if it no longer can stay, we'll take it out. With live flowers, when they start to mold, we'll compost. We compost live flowers, other things that are rooted, or cut flowers, I should say. And then other things that are actually planted, we'll put it in the planters. We'll leave things to the greenhouse if things get damaged by frost. If we have to compost it, we'll compost it. But we're very intentional. It's not really quick to remove things out of the memorial. We leave it in the memorial for as long as possible.
Thanks, Janelle. Marguerite's back on screen, which means we're limited in time, but I do want to, Maddie asked a question in the chat, which was a very open question that I wanted to make sure to pose back to you as well, which is when you think about, or when the community discusses the future of the memorial, what does it look like?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer this and Marguerite's question about how does somebody have a Janelle. I thought that was an interesting question. So basically, I think, again, bring your gifts to the square, bring your gifts to your community. What is it that you do? What do you feel called to do? And I think just like the image of the greenhouse, like where people in the community were like, we need to build a greenhouse. And then I was like, we need a greenhouse. And then someone's like, I'm a contractor, I can build a greenhouse. Somebody else is like, I'm a farmer, I can help make this happen. So it really is about knowing who's in your community and what role people can play and what gifts people have. Lean into your strengths, don't lean into your weaknesses. That's just a general rule of thumb that allows people in communities to work together or organizations to work together well. The future of GFGM looks like us being able to put the offerings. So we have over 3,000 offerings that we've been preserving and conserving, and they're all different sizes. And so our future looks like being able to put things back on exhibit. So that way at no cost to the public, because it's the memorial that the people built. And so the people should never, ever be charged to see their own voices. And so our work is to actually design a kind of business model where we can actually afford to keep the memorial free for people. And so part of that business model looks like developing our own center for art conservation. That centers Black art. And so we've been in dialogue with Black art conservators across the country, of which there's less than 20. And so there's a huge deficit in Black art conservators. And so how do we then leverage our platform with all of this Black story to create a platform for young people to engage a pipeline into the field of cultural heritage preservation by having the opportunity to conserve and preserve their own story. And so that is something that we really want to position the George Floyd Global Memorial to be able to do by building a Center for Black Art Conservation, where we can not only have a stream of income to sustain the existence of the memorial, but also be able to have an avenue to train young Black youth into an industry where we are grossly underrepresented.
Thank you, Janelle. Marguerite, I'm gonna, in the interest of time, turn it quickly over to you, but Janelle, with my thanks for allowing us to share space with you today.
Thank you.
I sincerely wish that I did not have to cut you off. I could talk to you about these thoughts all day. My favorite soundbite was, we know the story, we are the story, so we know how to preserve the story. And I am gonna continue to think about that and more. So thank you so much, Janelle. Thank you, Sarah, for your facilitation, and we'll see you again tomorrow for our last discussion, where we hope to kind of bring all 6 of these sessions together and talk about all of it. How do we feel after having all of these conversations? I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our primary funder for the series, the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I hope that everyone here as participants will also be able to join us tomorrow to discuss these questions with Sarah and together. There's going to be a separate link which should have the same which should go to the same confirmation email where you got this one. And so we will see you at 2 p.m. tomorrow in that Zoom room. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care, everyone.